For 20 years, I supported my loving wife and her family. Ours was a marriage filled with affection, like glue binding us together. We had a son and a daughter. Picture-perfect life with no regrets. Or so I thought, just as I believed we would live out our lives in bliss. She tragically drowned. Her sudden death shattered me. I was consumed by grief, tears becoming my constant companion. As I sorted through her belongings, I came across a copy of a property deed to an unfamiliar home. Curiosity led me to the address, but what awaited me was beyond anything I could have imagined. The house was lavishly decorated, exuding warmth and luxury. On the wall hung a portrait of my wife, her first love, and their twin children. The sight was a knife to my heart. On the desk lay a hastily written letter. Makoto, since your passing, I have found life unbearable. I can no longer endure this torment. Our children are in George's care now. I hope he will repay this debt of gratitude by looking after them. Now, I have no regrets. May we reunite in the afterlife, where we can be together forever. Rage consumed me as I yelled. My money was spent on them, and now they expect me to be grateful. Staggering back from the room, overwhelmed by the betrayal, a single thought burned in my mind. I wanted to dig up her grave and demand answers, but the fury surging through me took its toll. I blacked out and collapsed. Upon opening my eyes again, I found myself back in the 10th year of our marriage. Chapter 1. The police informed me they had found my wife Willow's body in the West Mountain Reservoir. I was at work, burning the midnight oil, frantically revising project details for a demanding client, over 40 years old and plagued by health issues, yet still working past 10 p.m. Like an old ox yoked to a plow, the call hit me like a storm cloud. At first, I thought it was a scam. Stop wasting my time. Scam calls can rot in hell. I barked, but the voice on the other end remained calm. The officer recited his badge number and explained. That night fishermen had discovered a woman's body. They found an ID card on her identifying her as my wife. He urged me to come immediately to assist with the investigation. Skepticism gripped me even as I hung up. I dialed Willow's number repeatedly on the drive to the reservoir, but her phone was off the entire time. 40 minutes later, I arrived at the location the officer described. The night was pitch black, the silence broken only by the eerie sounds of the reservoir's rushing water and the cries of unseen animals. My feet stumbled as I hurried toward the single beam of light piercing the darkness. There, lying lifeless on the riverbank, was a woman's body. She was wearing her favorite black dress, now soiled beyond recognition. Her shoes were gone, and her bare feet were marred with deep gashes. Blood trickled from her orifices, staining her face with haunting streaks. When I saw her face, I froze. Thunder seemed to crack over my head. It was her. It was my wife, Willow. Chapter 2. After conducting a thorough investigation, including an autopsy and reviewing surveillance footage near the reservoir, the police ruled out foul play in Willow's death. The forensic report revealed alcohol in her system, concluding it was an accidental drowning while intoxicated. When our two children heard about their mother's death, they rushed back from overseas, overwhelmed by grief, collapsed multiple times from skyrocketing blood pressure and ended up in the ICU. The children took full responsibility for their mother's funeral arrangements. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, Willow had already been laid to rest. When my children brought me to her grave, I was stunned to see that Willow had been buried alongside her ex-husband, Makoto. They had divorced more than 20 years ago. I turned to look at my children in disbelief. My daughter, Anna, spoke calmly. This was my mother's wish. She pulled a document from her bag and handed it to me. This is her will. The lawyer gave it to us when my brother and I returned home. You should take a look. Trembling, I took the document. It was true. Willow had requested to be buried with Makoto in her will. Anna continued. The last page outlines the distribution of assets. All the insurance payouts go to my brother and me. As for her personal properties, which she bought before marrying you, they are also designated to us. She hesitated before adding. About the house, Mom left your 50% share to you, but the other half needs to be compensated to us at market value. Alternatively, you can sell the house and split the proceeds equally with us. David, who had been silent, finally looked at me with a mixture of guilt and hesitation. Dad, Anna and I have obtained our green cards. Once everything is settled, we won't be returning to this country. Please take care of yourself. I stared at the two children I had raised for 20 years, my throat tightening painfully. My voice was hoarse, barely audible as I choked out. How can you be so ungrateful? I had been married to Willow for 20 years, becoming a father to David and Anna when they were barely 5 years old. I had loved my wife deeply, cared for her tenderly, and raised her children with all my heart. I had supported her parents with dedication and respect. And yet, in the end, they had taken everything from me. Chapter 3. Staggering home. I pushed open the door with what little strength I had left. The house was just as it had been when Willow was alive. We had lived here for nearly 20 years. I had bought this old apartment when we got married, despite it being her second marriage. I even handed over the dowry worth tens of thousands to her and used the rest of my savings to add her name to the title without hesitation. The apartment was over 30 years old, small, shabby, and cramped. Its usable area barely spanned 80 square meters. Yet it had housed 5 people, including my mother-in-law. For years, I had worked tirelessly to fund David and Anna's studies abroad and to cover my mother-in-law's monthly dialysis treatments. I scrimped and saved, often leaving myself with only a few hundred yuan for living expenses. I had always told myself that things would get better. Everything would get better. But now, I realized I had been nothing more than a tool for their family. My gaze was vacant, hollow, as I began packing up Willow's belongings, intending to throw everything out. While cleaning her wardrobe, I found an old magazine, hidden beneath a stack of clothes. Inside was a faded piece of paper, a photocopy of a property deed. The owner was listed as Willow. Following the address, I hired a locksmith, who verified my ID before opening the door to the apartment. When I stepped inside, I was utterly dumbfounded. This was clearly Willow and Makoto's love nest. The walls were adorned with photos of them and their twin children. The interior was lavishly decorated, cozy, sweet, and brimming with luxury. Expensive furniture, plush carpets, and a glittering crystal chandelier filled the space. It was worlds apart from the dilapidated, cramped home we had shared. Barely able to move, I made my way to the master bedroom. The room was enormous, with a walk-in closet, a dressing table, a king-sized bed, and a wide, sunlit bay window. The closet was neatly organized with clothes that looked undeniably expensive. Next door was a study. The sight of the study pierced through my heart. The walls were a chronicle of their families. Happiness, photos from the twins, elementary school years to their university days, taken in scenic spots across the globe. I stood there, paralyzed, as though struck by lightning. I suddenly recalled Willow telling me how her financial management skills had kept our household afloat. I had even thanked her for it. But it was my money, all my money. They had taken everything to fund their luxurious lifestyle, leaving me with mere scraps, just a few hundred yuan. And now they expected me to be grateful. I collapsed into a chair by the desk. A piece of paper lay open on the desk, with a handwritten message. Makoto, since you passed away 2 years ago, I've been consumed by thoughts of you, unable to bear the pain. Now that my mother is gone, and our children are grown, I have no attachments left. May we reunite in the afterlife. This wasn't an accidental drowning. It was a suicide born out of love. In a fit of rage, I shredded the paper into tiny fragments. Chapter 4. I don't know how long I sat there before I managed to stand, clutching my knees for support, stumbling out of the apartment. I was filled with a singular, burning desire to dig up Willow's grave. But the fury coursing through me was overwhelming, my grief and anger colliding in my chest. Blood gushed from my mouth as I staggered backward. My vision went dark, and I fell. Chapter 5. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself sitting at a table laden with food and drink. The room was filled with lively chatter, the clinking of plates and glasses creating a tidal wave of sound. Took me a moment to orient myself. But then I remembered this was the banquet we hosted, to celebrate David and Anna's success in their high school entrance exams. Both of them had been admitted to the best high school in the city. Not only did they receive full scholarships for 3 years, but each of them was also awarded a 6,000 yuan scholarship. At this moment, Willow and I were leading the children around, offering toasts to our friends and family. Everyone praised Willow, calling her a model mother and a university professor who had raised such outstanding children. Sitting beside my mother-in-law, Makoto wore a smug smile as he looked at Willow and the children, exuding an air of pride as if their accomplishments reflected on him. I drained my glass in one gulp, the bitter chill of the alcohol sliding down my throat was enough to remind me this was not a dream. Still dazed, a mocking voice suddenly cut through the noise. "George, you're really lucky. A cripple like you managed to marry our campus belle. Willow, what a steal. And you even got 2 great kids for free. Truly enviable." I turned to see who had spoken. It was Luis, a university senior 2 years ahead of Willow. He now taught at the same university as her, also in the philosophy department. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. Makoto raised an eyebrow and smirked, clearly enjoying the show. Luis clicked his tongue and added, "How did you get so lucky? I heard that 10 years ago, even after paying an exorbitant dowry, no one was willing to marry you. Who could have guessed that our dear Willow would stoop so low? So many men were after her. Yet she chose you. What a tragedy." I looked at his twisted expression, finding it both amusing and pathetic. It was no secret that Luis had harbored feelings for Willow for years, only for his close friend, Makoto, to beat him to the punch. By the time he learned of their relationship, Willow was already 2 months pregnant. Their friendship ended there, and then, later, Luis married someone else in heartbreak, only for Makoto to abruptly divorce Willow and abandon her with their 2 children to move abroad. Chapter 6. Luis had never truly let go of his resentment over not marrying Willow. As a result, he often targeted me, using every opportunity to poke at my old wounds. In the past, I had always felt inferior, and would meekly endure his jabs, swallowing my pride. These same words had been said to me in my previous life, and back then, I had held my tongue. After all, this was a celebratory banquet for my children. Their teachers and classmates were present, as well as some of Willow's colleagues. I hadn't wanted to cause a scene or give others a reason to laugh at me, but now, none of that mattered. I slammed my chopsticks onto the table with a loud crack and roared, "Lucky. Damn right. I'm lucky. Jealous. Are you? Why don't I hand her over to you? You've been pining after her for over a decade, haven't you? Maybe then you can stop acting like a clown in front of me every few days." Luis's face turned ashen. He darted a panicked glance toward his wife. He stammered, "George, what nonsense are you spouting?" I sneered, "Nonsense. Those disgusting messages you sent to Willow. The way you drool over her every time you see her. Do you think no one notices? And calling me a cripple over and over, to humiliate me. Does that make you feel big? Let me warn you, if you dare call me that again, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair." Yes, my leg was broken in a fight. And yet, even so, it was Willow who insisted on marrying me. And you, the goddess you worshipped, didn't even want you after her divorce, even with 2 kids in tow. So what are you showing off for? Everyone's eyes turned to me. Luis's wife stared at him with humiliation and fury. Willow hurried over and tugged at my sleeve, frowning in displeasure. What's wrong with you? Do you have to bring this up in front of everyone on such an important day? I yanked my arm free and replied coldly, bring it up. Did I start this? Hasn't he been provoking me every single time? Are you blind? Luis's wife bit her lip and approached him. The next moment, smack, she slapped him hard across the face, leaving him stunned. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the banquet hall. The previously noisy room fell silent. Luis, his face burning red from the slap, forced an awkward smile and stammered, I'm terribly sorry. There's a family matter I need to take care of. We'll be leaving now. I'll visit another day to apologize. With that, he fled in disgrace. Chapter 7. The banquet hall was steeped in an awkward silence. The people around me looked at me, with a mix of astonishment and unease. Makoto, who had been sitting back and enjoying the spectacle, rose from his seat. He walked over to stand beside Willow, a polite smile on his face, though his eyes gleamed with provocation and scorn. In a measured, courteous tone, he said, George, while no one is judging you for your past, there's no need to flaunt it in front of everyone, is there? After all, you're now the backbone of this family, Willow's husband, and the father of 2 children. Bringing these things up doesn't just demean you, it embarrasses Willow and makes it hard for the kids to face their peers in the future. I followed Makoto's gaze to David and Anna, standing not far away. David's fists were clenched tightly, his eyes bloodshot, while Anna's eyes brimmed with tears, glaring at me with hatred and disgust. Remembering how they had coldly waved Willow's will at me in the cemetery, pressing me to sell the house and split the proceeds with them, I let out a bitter laugh. Their real father isn't dead. What right do I have to call myself their dad? When he's dead, maybe then we can talk. Makoto stammered. You! How can you say something like that? He faltered, turning to Willow with a frown. A flicker of resentment crossed Willow's eyes as she grabbed my sleeve again, pulling me back and whispering sharply, George, what's wrong with you? Everyone's watching. Do you really want people to look down on us? Chapter 8. I turned to face her, the woman before me, and waves of overwhelming hatred surged in my chest. Sensing the tension, one of the guests quickly stepped in to smooth things over. Professor Liu, come on. We need your advice on raising kids. My son keeps failing his exams. How do you usually communicate with your children? Gradually, the noise returned to the banquet hall, the awkward atmosphere dispersing. I sank back into my chair, my gaze cold as I surveyed the scene before me. My chest felt tight with anger, pouring myself another drink. I downed it in one go. I knew the wisest choice now would be to divorce Willow, leave this parasitic family behind, and start over. But after being deceived for an entire lifetime, how could I simply walk away and let go of this hatred? Chapter 9. The banquet eventually came to an end, the guests dispersing. Only Willow, her mother, Makoto, and the twins remained in the hall with me. My mother-in-law's grating voice broke the silence. She sneered, George, you may not care about saving face, but we do. What's with your pity show? Are you desperate for everyone to know you're a cripple? Do you think your past is something to be proud of? Getting into a fight at school and ending up with a broken leg? How disgraceful. Serves you right. Why didn't they hit someone else? Have you ever reflected on that? Even if you were a millionaire, no one in our family would have taken you seriously. You're nothing but a useless cripple. You're not worthy of our Willow. Willow cut in. Mom, can you stop? George is a victim here. Why do you have to say such things? I looked at my mother-in-law, robust and full of energy. At this point in time, she hadn't yet been diagnosed with chronic kidney failure. Naturally, she didn't need to rely on me to take her to weekly dialysis appointments, prepare her meals according to strict dietary guidelines, or cater to her every need. In my previous life, after her diagnosis, Willow conveniently developed a phobia of hospitals and left me to care for her mother for nearly 8 years. Rain or shine, every Saturday, I would drive her to the hospital for treatment. She passed away peacefully just 2 months before Willow's suicide. Thinking of Willow's farewell letter, where she wrote of fulfilling her filial duty, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. What duty? It was all on me. I let out a cold laugh and said, if I weren't a cripple, do you think I would have even looked at Willow? You think your daughter is so exceptional. Even her associate professorship was a handout. If it weren't for my father running himself ragged to secure her a recommendation from a colleague, she'd still just be a junior lecturer. Don't act all high and mighty while playing the victim. You're just a family of hypocrites. My words hung in the air, freezing the room in an oppressive silence. My mother-in-law, caught completely off guard by my bluntness, turned pale, her face twisting in anger. She trembled uncontrollably, too enraged to speak. Chapter 10. Standing nearby, Willow seemed stung by my words. George, are you sick? All this fuss just because Louise said a few things about you, she yelled. Anna chimed in, raising her voice. This is supposed to be my and David's celebration banquet. What's so great about being a cripple? Why did you have to bring up those embarrassing things? How am I supposed to hold my head high in front of my classmates now? Why do you always ruin everything for everyone? I took a deep breath, suppressing the fury that threatened to boil over. Turning to Willow, I said, you're right. I am sick. Do you have a cure? Let me say this one more time. If I hear him call me a cripple again, I'll make sure he spends the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Then I shifted my gaze to Anna. And who are you to me? Whether you can hold your head high in front of your classmates has nothing to do with me. You're short, ugly, and have flared nostrils. Honestly, letting you take my last name was humiliating for me. Who can I complain to about that? Anna froze, utterly stunned. Though she and David were twins, their appearances were vastly different. David resembled their father, while Anna was the spitting image of her grandmother. Her composure shattered. She burst into tears, wailing as she stomped her short legs out of the banquet hall. I had no interest in continuing this argument. Grabbing my jacket from the coat rack, I left without another word. Chapter 11. Outside the hotel, the sky had turned completely dark. The summer night breeze carried a faint coolness, though it still felt sticky against my skin. I kicked a pebble as I walked, my mind swirling with chaotic thoughts. Memories of the past flooded back, suffocating me like water filling my lungs. In my second year of high school, I had been the victim of bullying. After rejecting a classmate's confession, I was ambushed on my way home by a group of thugs. The security situation back then wasn't as good as it is now, and many alleys lacked surveillance cameras. They demanded I kneel and apologize to the girl. I resisted with all my strength. In the ensuing struggle, I landed a solid kick on the leader. That single act enraged him. He threw me to the ground and, cursing, swung a steel rod down on me with brutal force. When he was done, he dumped me like garbage by a trash bin. My parents searched for me all night. By the time I was found and taken to the hospital, it was too late. The injuries left me permanently disabled. When the doctor broke the news, my mother fainted on the spot. My father's hair turned white almost overnight. Though the leader of the gang was sentenced to 10 years in prison, the damage he caused was irreversible. I spent 3 months attached to a urinary catheter and underwent a full year of psychological therapy before I could even begin to function again. From that point on, I became withdrawn, self-loathing, and unworthy in my own eyes. I refused to date, convinced I didn't deserve anyone's love. Then I met Willow. She was like a beacon of light, piercing the darkness of my life. I thought she was my salvation, the guiding star that would steer me out of despair. So I poured everything into our marriage. I endured her mother's harshness and the resentment of her children, fueled by their grandmother and biological father. I worked hard to maintain peace, despite their constant antagonism. I cherished the marriage, believing in its worth. But I never imagined that Willow, the light in my life, was the shadow hiding behind it. She was the hand dragging me into the abyss, condemning me to eternal torment. All the good memories turned into sharp blades under her manipulation, cutting me to pieces. Chapter 12. By the time I reached home, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark, suggesting everyone had gone to bed. On the balcony, a faint rustling sound broke the silence of the night. It was oddly eerie. I turned on the light and walked to the balcony to investigate. There, I saw a bamboo basket covered with a fine mesh sack. The noise was coming from inside. The sight sent shivers down my spine. Inside the basket were venomous snakes. This was disturbingly familiar. In my previous life, after David and Anna's exam results came out, my mother-in-law claimed her prayers to Buddha had been answered. She somehow procured over a dozen venomous snakes, intending to take the kids to a mountain to release them. When I found out, I strongly objected, suggesting she release carp instead. She scoffed, saying animals released in rituals couldn't be eaten later. She still wanted to eat carp but had no intention of eating venomous snakes. Seeing I couldn't reason with her, I took matters into my own hands. Early one morning, while she was out walking in the park, I took the snakes to a wildlife rescue center. The staff there were horrified when they opened the bag. It was full of highly venomous banded krites. As these snakes are a nationally protected species, they immediately called the police. I endured a long hour of criticism and had to sign a written guarantee that I wouldn't engage in illegal wildlife trading before being allowed to leave. My mother-in-law was furious, accusing me of ruining her spiritual progress. I turned away from the balcony and went back to my room. This time, I had no intention of interfering. Chapter 13. Early the next morning, my mother-in-law returned home with breakfast in hand and loudly instructed Willow, "Go wake David and Anna for breakfast. I need to take them to the mountain for the release ceremony afterward." Willow pursed her lips and said, "Mom, can't you stop involving the kids in these superstitious rituals?" My mother-in-law shot her a glare and retorted, "What do you know? If I hadn't prayed to Buddha back then, do you think the kids would have done so well on their exams? Or that George could make any money? It's all thanks to Buddha's blessings." Willow frowned slightly but, seeing she couldn't argue, reluctantly went to knock on David and Anna's doors. After the kids finished washing up and sat down at the dining table, my mother-in-law distributed breakfast to everyone except me. I didn't mind. I went back to my room, grabbed the IDs, marriage certificate, and household registration I had prepared, and slammed the door on my way out. I hailed a cab straight to the real estate registry office. As expected, a 230 square meter property was listed under Willow's name. The registration date, 3 years ago, which coincided with the year Makoto returned to the country. The property's mortgage had been paid off just 2 months ago. I requested the staff to stamp the inquiry document for me. Chapter 14. Shortly after finishing a meeting, my office phone rang. I pressed the speaker button. David's panicked voice came through, crying, "Dad, please come quickly. Grandma got bitten by a venomous snake while doing the release ceremony. She passed out from the pain, and I can't carry her. We're on the South Hill. Halfway up. You know the spot, it's where we picnicked last time. Near that huge boulder. Mom's phone isn't working. Dad, I'm scared." The The snakes are everywhere. Get away from me. Don't come near. His terrified screams sent chills down my spine. He continued, Dad, can you hear me? Please hurry. I instinctively picked up my mobile phone, ready to dial 120 for emergency services. But just as I was about to press the call button, my hand froze mid-air. I slowly put the phone back down. Surely the Buddha my mother-in-law prayed to would protect her and her grandchildren. Wouldn't it? I spoke into the receiver. David, I'm out of town. You should try calling your mom or dial 120 for help. There was a brief silence on the other end before he said, Dad, I'm calling you on your office landline. I was momentarily speechless. Recovering. I said, what I mean is, I'm just about to leave for a trip. The cab is already waiting downstairs. I can't help you right now. Good luck. With that, I hung up and turned off my phone. Chapter 15. My mother-in-law was bitten multiple times by banded krites, and David was bitten twice on his left calf. Anna, who was dealing with menstrual cramps that day, had stayed behind and narrowly avoided the disaster. Since the incident occurred in the middle of the mountain, took over 3 hours after their initial call for emergency services to locate them. The krite venom, being highly toxic, had devastating effects. My mother-in-law had already fallen unconscious, and David was exhibiting symptoms like blurred vision and slurred speech by the time help arrived. Both their lives were saved after extensive emergency treatment. However, my mother-in-law's condition was dire. She had been bitten in multiple places, with deep wounds that caused severe necrosis and gangrene. The doctors warned this was only the beginning. Her muscle tissues in the affected areas were likely to completely deteriorate, making it nearly impossible for her to walk again. As for David, his leg showed signs of numbness and weakness. Even more troubling, the doctor explained that krite venom affects the nervous system, potentially causing memory loss, difficulty concentrating, sleep disturbances, and irreversible damage to multiple organs. For a student about to start high school, the prognosis was devastating. I showed up at the hospital 3 days after the incident, having claimed I was out of town. I had to keep up the act. The moment Willow saw me, she nearly screamed, her voice shrill enough to make my ears ring. Where have you been these past few days? Why couldn't I reach you? David was bitten by a snake and called you, but you didn't rush to help. If you had brought the rescue team sooner and they'd gotten the antivenom in time, their condition wouldn't be this bad. I can't count on you for anything. I glanced at the 2 patients lying in their hospital beds. One was semi-conscious, while the other stared blankly at the ceiling. I sighed and said, I was sent out of town for an emergency assignment. My phone was stolen as soon as I arrived. How was I supposed to know? Something had happened at home. Then I countered. Wait a minute. I told David to contact you right away. Didn't you go to help them? What kind of mother are you? Willow froze, the hysteria fading from her voice. I pressed on, feigning disappointment and anger. One of them is your own mother. The other is your son. How could you be so cold-blooded? And now you have the nerve to blame me. What exactly were you doing that was more important than saving your mother and son? A flicker of guilt crossed her face, and her tone softened. I didn't mean to blame you. It's just, you disappeared for 3 days, and I was so worried. I was just too upset. Since you're here now, could you stay and help take care of Mom and David? I need to go home and take a shower. I rejected her outright. No, I've got a mountain of work to deal with back at the office. Hire a nurse to take care of them. Willow bit her lip, clearly displeased, but in the end, she nodded. Chapter 16. David was discharged from the hospital before my mother-in-law, but he seemed to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. He often woke up screaming from nightmares and avoided areas with dense greenery. Even the rustling sound of leaves in the wind made him cover his ears and scream in terror. Looking at David like this, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Once, I had truly cared for him and Anna as if they were my own children. But now, if anyone were to blame, it would be his grandmother's. Buddha for failing to protect him. By mid-July, registration for the new high school term began. However, David's current state made it impossible for him to attend. I went to the school and filed for his leave of absence, which was quickly approved, due to his excellent exam results. When I handed the leave of absence certificate to David, he covered his face and broke down in tears. Perhaps he realized that this leave of absence was merely a temporary escape. He would never return to that prestigious high school. I sighed silently. This was the last thing I could do for him. Chapter 17. I put our old apartment on the market through a real estate agency. Though the place was old and cramped, it was in a good school district and could fetch a price of 500,000 to 600,000 yuan. However, I had already lined up a buyer who would purchase it for just 300,000 yuan. The day before my mother-in-law was discharged from the hospital, I checked myself into the same hospital. Over the years, my salary card had been in Willow's possession. I had always scrimped and saved, never asking her for money, so when I asked Willow for money to pay the hospital deposit, she was stunned. Do you have to be hospitalized right now? Who's going to take care of my mom after she's discharged? She asked, visibly annoyed. Looking at the displeased woman before me, I handed her the hospitalization paperwork and explained that a nodule had been found in my lung. The doctor recommended immediate surgery. The nodule was small, but it pressed against my trachea, causing persistent coughing. The doctor suggested removing it as soon as possible. In my previous life, I had delayed the surgery for 3 months. This time, I intentionally scheduled it earlier. Willow pressed her lips tightly together, taking several deep breaths. She looked like she was on the verge of exploding, but in the end, she maintained her dutiful wife persona and handed me my salary card from her purse. I called my cousin, who was home for summer vacation from college, and asked him to accompany me at the hospital for a few days. The day after my surgery, while my cousin went downstairs for lunch, Willow appeared in my room with several documents and asked me to sign them. Still weak from the surgery and unable to eat, I felt groggy. Yet, she insisted. She explained that one of her friends had recently lost her job and was now selling insurance. Buying a few short-term policies would help her meet her quota. It's not expensive, she said. Just 100 or 200 yuan per policy for a 1-year term. Just help me out by signing at the bottom. She'll take care of the rest. She handed me a pen and even took out her phone, preparing to record the moment. Just then, my cousin returned to retrieve his phone. Seeing Willow pressuring me to sign something, he looked surprised. Sis, what's so urgent that my brother has to sign it now? He's barely coherent. Can he even read the documents properly? Let me take a look first. As he reached for the documents, Willow quickly gathered them into her bag and forced a stiff smile. Oh my, I forgot he just had surgery. I was only thinking about helping my friend with her insurance quota. We'll wait a few days for him to recover before signing anything, she said before hastily leaving the room. My cousin shot her a suspicious look and muttered, Sis, you're not trying to sneak in a loan agreement or something shady, are you? Though said in jest. His words made Willow's face turn pale. She snapped back. What nonsense are you spouting? You're a college student. How can you be so rude? With that, she fled the room in embarrassment. My cousin looked dissatisfied, but I handed him his phone and apologized on her behalf, urging him to go eat and not take her words to heart. He reluctantly went downstairs, still fuming. Chapter 18. The next day, during the doctor's rounds, I was advised to start moving around to help with my recovery. My cousin borrowed a wheelchair and suggested we go for a stroll in the hospital garden while the weather was still cool. After walking for about 10 minutes, we grew tired and sat down on a bench behind an artificial hill to rest. Suddenly, a familiar female voice caught my attention. Makoto, I'll come over tonight. Why did you come to the hospital so early? I turned and followed the voice. Willow was leaning into Makoto's arms, holding a thermos, her expression a mix of bashfulness and exasperation. I placed a finger over my lips, signaling my cousin to stay quiet, and moved slightly behind the artificial hill to listen. Makoto frowned and said, I can't stand the thought of you spending 2 hours making chicken soup for that cripple. Does he even deserve your kindness? Willow giggled and said, Are you jealous? Makoto, every time I come to your place, I'm the one cooking and making soup. Now that he's sick, I've only brought him food twice. Besides, you wouldn't want him to become gravely ill, leaving my mom and the kids without support. Would you? Or do you plan to take care of us? In that case, I'll divorce him right away and remarry you. Makoto scoffed. I'm not stupid. Why would I take on that burden? Let him spend his money and effort raising my kids for me. Isn't it perfect? A free ride is always better. As for your mom, who could put up with her temper, I'd rather stick with what we have now, no strings attached. He then asked, By the way, did you get him to sign that gift agreement to transfer the house to my name? Willow pouted. Not yet. That brat of a cousin ruined it. I almost succeeded. It's not a big deal if he doesn't sign it himself. But if he ever finds out and takes it to court, it might get revoked. I'll find another chance. Makoto chuckled. Take your time. I'll be waiting. He reached for the thermos in her hand, saying, Let me try your cooking first. I haven't had breakfast yet. Willow hesitated but eventually opened the lid for him. Makoto smugly raised the thermos, took a sniff, and then a sip. The next second, he spat the soup back into the container, grimacing. Why is it so bland and greasy? It's disgusting. He covered the thermos and handed it back, saying, This soup isn't fit for me. Let your dear husband have it. Willow smiled sheepishly, dabbing at his mouth with a tissue. It's supposed to be light since he just had surgery. The chicken might have been a bit fatty, but I'll make a fresh pot for you tonight. Makoto, wait for me downstairs. I'll take this up to him and be right back. The two of them walked toward the hospital building, arm in arm. My cousin, who had been silent, turned to me, his face streaked with tears. He gripped my wrist tightly, his hands trembling with rage. I forced a smile at him. His tears flowed more freely as he choked out, Bro, I want to kill those bastards. I patted his back gently, trying to calm him down. Killing them would be too easy. I wanted them to live and suffer. Chapter 19. After being discharged from the hospital, I discovered that Willow had temporarily sent her mother to a care home, likely planning to bring her back for me to care for once I recovered. How convenient. The real estate agent called, informing me that there was a buyer for our apartment. When Willow found out about my decision to sell the house, she exclaimed, Are you crazy? Where will we live if you sell it? I smiled and replied, I'm planning to get a bigger place. This apartment is too cramped for a family. She frowned. We don't have the money for that kind of upgrade right now. With my mom's condition and David's physical therapy, money is tight everywhere. Sure, this apartment is old, but its location is convenient. It's close to the hospital, and we don't even need a car to get there. Looking at her meaningfully, I said, I don't have much money myself, but don't you? You've been managing my salary for years, haven't you? And all our expenses came from my paycheck. What about your earnings after you became an associate professor? Don't tell me you don't have any money. Willow's expression faltered slightly, and she stammered, I do, but most of my money is tied up in investments. I can't withdraw it immediately. Seeing her bring up investments, I pressed further. Well then, since you've invested our shared funds, I'll need to review the details. After all, this is marital property. I just want to verify the amounts you've invested and ensure they align with your income over the years. Of course, she wasn't going to let me check. Those funds had gone into purchasing the house. And even if there were investments, she never intended to share them with me. No problem. I made a quick call to my lawyer, asking him to come over and notarize an agreement. I requested that Willow confirm, under oath, that all investments under her name as of today were considered marital property. She hesitated, her face flushing as she bit her lip. George, what are you implying? Do you suspect me of something? I shook my head with a smile. If these investments were made with our money, then they're marital property. This is just a formality. Unless, of course, you're hiding something from me. Of course not. She snapped. Then why won't you sign? I asked. Willow was at a loss for words. Seeing her reluctance, I turned to the lawyer. If my wife has secretly transferred assets, how can I legally trace her financial transactions? Willow's body trembled, and the pen in her hand fell to the ground. The lawyer, catching on, replied earnestly, "You would need to apply for a court order. Once granted, a lawyer could assist in tracing all her bank accounts and financial holdings, including stocks, funds, and bonds. However, this process is typically only pursued during divorce proceedings for asset division." Before he could finish, Willow had already signed and stamped the agreement. Handing it to me, I took it with a faint smile and asked the lawyer to record the notarization on video. Chapter 20. A month later, the house was sold. The transaction closed at 300,000 yuan, with the buyer being a friend I had arranged beforehand. Willow was incredulous and called the agent multiple times to confirm. The agent patiently explained that, while the apartment was in a school district, the new elementary and middle school campuses were under construction and would relocate within 3 years. After that, this area would essentially become an urban slum. Willow, no fool, tried to cancel the sale. The agent produced the contract she and I had signed, explaining, "If you unilaterally terminate the agreement, you'll need to compensate the buyer 20% of the sale price." I interjected to smooth things over. "Forget it. Selling for 300,000 is already decent. Mrs. Zhang next door only sold her 100 square meter place for 380,000. Once the schools move, it'll be impossible to sell. My dad heard we're upgrading and even offered to pitch in 500,000. Let's just move on." Mrs. Zhang had indeed sold her place for 380,000, but it was to her sister-in-law, as she had already purchased a new home. Hearing that my father would contribute to the new house, Willow reluctantly let the matter drop. The 300,000 yuan from the sale was transferred to me immediately. I threw it all into cryptocurrency, ensuring the funds would lose value. My friend bought low while I bought high, recovering the funds on his end. This money was destined to be a total loss in my hands. Chapter 21. After selling the house, I hired movers to relocate all our belongings to Makoto's upscale apartment, the one registered under Willow's name. David followed me nervously when he realized the moving address was his biological father's home. Shame overwhelmed him. He flushed red, fidgeting with his hands. I laughed and said, "You're familiar with this place, aren't you? I'm sure there's even a room here for you." His face turned beet red as he wrung his hands anxiously. Knocking on the door yielded no response. In David's presence, I called the police and a locksmith. I informed the officers that my property had been illegally occupied, with the intruder changing the locks. I presented the necessary documents, including a stamped property search result. With the locksmith's help, I opened the door without issue. Makoto arrived just as the movers were finishing up. He erupted in anger, yelling, "Get out! This is my home with Willow. What does this have to do with you?" I calmly pulled out my marriage certificate and waved it in his face. "This property is marital property. shared between me and Willow. You're the one who needs to leave. The police confirmed the property was under Willow's name and, as such, was marital property. They informed Makoto that he must vacate immediately and could face legal action and financial compensation if I pursued the matter further. Makoto froze in place. He fumbled for his phone to call Willow, hoping she could intervene. I sneered at him. Willow was in no position to help. Just 2 days ago, I had sent all the evidence of their affair, collected by a private investigator, to the disciplinary committee at Willow's school and the local education authority. She was probably being investigated as we spoke. Chapter 22. After work, Willow learned about everything that had happened. Surprisingly, she didn't lash out at me as usual. Instead, she knelt before me, pleading and apologizing profusely. She claimed that she had only lent the house to Makoto temporarily and had kept it from me out of fear of misunderstanding. After spewing her excuses, she tearfully begged me to speak to my father, asking him to use his connections to help cover up her misconduct at school. Without intervention, she would no longer be able to work as a teacher. She choked on her words as she promised to sever all ties with Makoto and devote herself fully to our family. I stood over her, watching in silence. A scandal over her misconduct was minor. There were much bigger storms on the horizon. Using the excuse of convincing my father, I moved back to my parents' house. Mainly, I wanted to distance myself in case she couldn't handle the impending blows and did something irreversible that might implicate me. Not long ago, while rummaging through an old laptop of Willow's, I decided to refurbish it for 200 yuan, to see if there was anything useful on it. To my surprise, I found evidence of plagiarism in her academic papers. Nearly 30% of her content was lifted through translated copying. I reported the findings to the journal that had published her work. It didn't take long for them to issue a retraction notice, removing her paper from their database and blacklisting her from future submissions. The journal also forwarded evidence of her misconduct to her university, which immediately launched an investigation. What shocked me even more was when Luis submitted his own formal complaint against Willow. He accused her of plagiarizing his research, selling co-authorship credits, and inflating project budgets. I later learned the reason behind his drastic actions. Following the disastrous banquet, Luis's wife had filed for divorce. She'd heard whispers of Luis's obsession with Willow before, but the final straw came when she caught him begging for her forgiveness. Devastated, Luis drank himself into a stupor and stumbled into a bar only to witness Willow and Makoto kissing. In his drunken rage, he tried to fight Makoto but was slapped by Willow in front of everyone. Only then did Luis realize that he had been nothing more than a pawn in Willow's schemes for years. Furious and humiliated, he filed a public complaint, with others taking action. I joined the fray and sued Willow for bigamy and for concealing marital assets. However, Willow used every excuse in the book to avoid attending court hearings, delaying the trial indefinitely. Chapter 23. Anna seemed unaware of the chaos engulfing her family. She called, yelling at me for not sending her living expenses. I've messaged you so many times asking for money. Are you ignoring me on purpose? I hung up mid-rant and blocked her on all platforms. After 2 months of investigation, Willow was stripped of her academic title and dismissed from her teaching position due to misconduct and plagiarism. She was also ordered to repay any misappropriated funds. The day after her dismissal, I received a call from the care home, informing me that my mother-in-law had died of respiratory failure before they could arrange emergency medical care. I relayed the news to Willow. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I didn't attend the funeral, citing poor health. From that point on, their family affairs had nothing to do with me. That evening, While working late at the office, I received another call from the police. They informed me that Willow had fallen into the West Mountain Reservoir but was rescued by a night fisherman who called 120 to have her sent to the city hospital. At the hospital, I learned that while Willow's life was no longer in immediate danger, her thigh had been severely cut by a sharp underwater object, leading to a serious infection due to prolonged immersion. The doctor presented me with 3 treatment options and began to explain each in detail. I interrupted. Just tell me which one is the cheapest. The doctor hesitated before replying. The cheapest option would be amputation. But then amputate, I said without hesitation. The doctor seemed taken aback. There are other options, such as vascular surgery or a transplant. Amputation isn't the only solution, especially since she's still young. Just amputate, I insisted. I can't afford a transplant or any of those other surgeries. Where's the consent form? I'll sign it. Reluctantly, the doctor handed me the consent form, his expression complicated. Without a second thought, I signed my name. I wasn't about to spend a fortune on her medical bills, especially since we were still married. Any expense she incurred would fall on me as well. Choosing the cheapest option was only logical. Chapter 24. Since waking up from her surgery, Willow had been in a dazed state, unable to distinguish between past and present. I picked up her phone and dialed Makoto. She stared at me like I was insane. The moment Makoto's panicked voice came through, he said, "Willow, where have you been? I couldn't reach you for days. Anna's teacher says she's distracted by a puppy love situation, and David's mental state isn't improving. I don't know what to do and couldn't find you anywhere." Hearing Makoto's voice, Willow became visibly emotional. With disbelief, she asked, "Makoto, you're alive. Didn't you die 2 years ago from pancreatic cancer?" She turned to me, her tear-filled eyes, seemingly begging for confirmation. On the other end, Makoto replied, "What's wrong with you? I'm perfectly fine. Who told you I had cancer?" Willow pressed on. "What about David? Were they bullied abroad?" Makoto sighed in frustration. "Are you out of your mind? It wasn't abroad. Your mom dragged him to the mountain for that ridiculous ritual, and he got bitten by a snake." Willow's body trembled, and her pupils constricted. She abruptly tried to get out of bed, tossing the covers aside. It was only when she saw that she was missing a leg that she froze. How could I describe her expression at that moment? For words, a masterpiece of despair. She stared at her severed leg for what felt like an eternity, her body collapsing back onto the bed as if all strength had left her. Minutes later, the hospital room was filled with Willow's heart-wrenching cries. Chapter 25. Despite numerous court summonses for the divorce proceedings, Willow refused to appear. Thankfully, the evidence I provided was sufficient for the court to proceed in her absence. As the party at fault, she was awarded 30% of the marital property. Custody of the children was naturally granted to her. Additionally, Makoto was ordered to return all assets Willow had secretly transferred to him. After the division, I kept the house and the car, while the rest went to Willow. Finally free from that toxic family, my life became lighter and more relaxed. Quit my job, bought a camper van, and decided to travel while I was still young. I began recording my journey and uploading the videos online. Unexpectedly, the content gained a large following and eventually started earning me an income. I decided to become a full-time travel vlogger. The next time I heard about Willow was 2 years later. During a meal with friends, someone mentioned her. They said that at Makoto's engagement party, she caused a scene, smashing hotel and wedding decorations in a fit of rage. Makoto called the police. She paid for the damages but was also detained for 15 days. After her release, she spent her days drinking in bars, utterly ruining herself. Anna dropped out of high school due to Willow and Makoto frequently forgetting to send her living expenses. Anna moved in with a wealthy schoolmate. She hoped to secure financial stability, but instead, she became pregnant. The school expelled Anna after the incident. Willow, dragging her disabled body, went to confront the wealthy family, only to have dirt thrown back at her. They claimed Anna had willingly sold herself. The wealthy family paid 60,000 yuan to bury the matter. The young man continued his studies unscathed, while that sum effectively ended Anna's future. Hearing all this, I couldn't help but feel a tinge of sorrow. Memories of the past surfaced, and I let out a faint sigh. Later, Makoto was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer again. His fiancée left him as soon as she found out. He tried to return to Willow, only to find that she had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where she had gone. Chapter 26. Time flew by, and 2 more years passed. I no longer traveled as often, instead using the time to buy a villa with a small yard while property. Prices were still reasonable. I adopted a cat and a dog and filled the garden with flowers and plants. One evening after dinner, I took the dog for a walk in a nearby park. Behind me, a trembling voice called out, "Dad!" I turned around to see David. He walked with a slight limp, wearing a blue-gray work uniform with the name of a machinery factory embroidered on the chest. His eyes were red, and his face was full of emotion. I froze for a moment before, smiling and gently correcting him. "I'm not your dad anymore. You can call me Uncle." He shuddered, and tears began streaming down his face. The dog strained against its leash, eager to run ahead. Smiling faintly, I said to David, "Probably wants to play up ahead. You're welcome to visit me at home if you have time." Turning away, I continued walking, but my vision grew blurry. In my mind's eye, I saw 2 small children from years ago, a shy little girl and a boy with wide, curious eyes. The boy had asked, "Who are you? Why are you in our house?" I had patted his head and replied, "I'm your dad." The children's eyes had lit up with excitement as they hugged me and shouted, "We have a dad now. I'm going to tell everyone in kindergarten that I have a dad too." But how had it all come to this?